Welcome. I'm delighted you've joined us today for our curator conversation about Arthur Jafa's Love is the Message is Death. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Stephanie Stebich, and I have the pleasure of being the Margaret and Terry Stent Director of the Smithsonian American Art Museum. I'm also the Chief Gratitude Officer, and in that regard, I would like to acknowledge some of the terrific people who've come together to help make this program possible. First of all, again, I welcome all of you. We have over 400 people participating. That's really wonderful to see. And although we convene in cyberspace this afternoon, we want to gratefully acknowledge the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here in Washington, D.C., where I sit, and the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we convene, as well as the labor of those who were enslaved in constructing the historic building that is home to the Smithsonian American Art Museum. So I invite you to take a moment to reflect on what lands you sit. As you know, from June 26th through June 28th, 13 museums across the United States and the world streamed Arthur Jafa's powerful video examining Black life in America, again with this provocative title, Love is the Message is Death. Let me tell you, getting 13 museums to work in concert through different time zones was no small feat. So I'm very grateful for my incredible staff who pulled this off. And over 125,000 people viewed this over this 48-hour time span. This effort was organized by SAAM and our sister museum, the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, because we jointly own this Arthur Jafa video. Our effort was planned and supported with the artist who really urged us to reach new audiences, to share this powerful video with people who would not necessarily encounter it in our museum galleries. We really are grateful for his active participation. For those of you who are not as familiar with the video, it is a really important and very moving montage of both original and found or appropriated footage that explores the mix of joy and pain, transcendence and tragedy that characterize the Black American experience. The joint effort of sharing the video was in response in part to the aftermath of the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and countless others. And as protests against racial oppression swept across our country and continued today, we thought this was a worthy effort. We fully recognize that screening or showing works of art is not enough at this time. However, we support the challenging conversations they can spark in promoting dialogue and fostering understanding, and that is the purpose of our conversation today. We know Jafa's work raises tough questions and brings up powerful emotions. And so we again invite you with this program into further insight. When we screened the work, we invited our viewers to submit questions and reactions. And based on that, we have put this discussion together. And I hope that this gives you some deeper sense of the work itself, the video, and also some reflection on your own personal life history. I truly believe art changes the way we see the world. We at the Smithsonian American Art Museum have great leadership in Secretary Lonnie Bunch, and he has called on all of us to confront racism and social inequities in our nation, as well as within the Smithsonian and our own institution at the American Art Museum. He also reminds us we need a diversity of views, and that's why I think having several curators in conversation is particularly enlightening. He also challenges us to further our relevance, our reach, and our impact in the work that we do. So as the leader of the nation's Museum of American Art, I believe that art can be a powerful tool for change. It allows us to grapple with our national past and present, some of it bitter or resilient, and also joyful, various chapters in our history that art invites us to reconsider. I also want you to know that SAAM's leadership, including our staff and our board of commissioners, is deeply committed to addressing racism and systemic inequities in the work we do here at the museum, both externally and internally in both transparent and accountable ways. And I look forward to sharing with you more of our upcoming plans. We do need a greater diversity of ideas, as the Secretary reminds us, in all the work that we do. And so we're particularly grateful for your interest in this program and our museum. I also truly believe museums are safe spaces for difficult conversations. And so we invite more people to have those conversations with us as we seek to help our country both understand and heal from this unprecedented time where we are really facing double pandemics. On behalf of SAAM, back to my role as Chief Gratitude Officer, please know that I express our thanks and gratitude to artists like Arthur Jafa, who help us reckon with the history of our country, a history that includes racial oppression, and helps us open forums, spaces for reflection, dialogue, and ultimately understanding. And I know you value this too, because you've tuned in with us today. So again, we have a robust conversation ahead, a program that features two of our distinguished curators, and I'm delighted that Dr. Carmen Ramos, our acting chief curator and curator of Latinx art here, a leading scholar in her field, along with Dr. Saisha Grayson, our curator of time-based media, are participating. Saisha is the one who brought this wonderful work to the museum. And always wonderful to have an esteemed colleague from one of our sister museums, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Dr. Rhea Combs, join us. She's the curator of film and photography there. Enough from me. I now turn over the program to our three esteemed experts and insightful curators.
Thank you, Stephanie, for such a lovely introduction. And good afternoon and welcome to everyone for this special conversation about Arthur Jafa's powerful 2016 moving image work, Love is the Message is Death, that explores the Black experience in the United States. I'm Carmen Ramos, acting chief curator and curator of Latinx art here at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And we're really excited about this discussion. When we screened Arthur Jafa's emotionally charged video on a continuous loop over 2 days, we invited our viewers to submit their questions and statements. And today's program is completely informed by the queries the public submitted to us from their homes and devices. I'm joined today by two Smithsonian colleagues, and together we will respond to the thoughtful questions and statements the audience shared with us. So joining me are Saisha Grayson, SAAM's curator of time-based media art, and Rhea Combs, curator of film and photography at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Saisha is the curator responsible, as Stephanie said, for spearheading our joint acquisition of Arthur Jafa's work with the Hirshhorn. And Rhea has been friends with the artist over many years and is in charge of her museum's collection of moving image work that shares a lot in common with the kinds of images AJ, as he prefers to be called, has used in his work. Thank you both for being here today. But before we start, I just wanted to make everyone aware that there are additional resources on SAAM's website to allow you to learn more about Love is the Message and the Message is Death. You can find a few clips of the video, a recorded program with AJ and critic Greg Tate, sort of discussing the video frame by frame. Additionally, there are two illuminating panel discussions that were produced by Sun House that were held in conjunction with the screening, with several curators, artists, and scholars that discuss the video at length, and they're wonderful. And currently on SAAM's blog, you can read responses to Jafa's work from Black cultural leaders from our local region. So thank you all for doing that. And lastly, we'll have time for a few questions from our listening audience toward the end of our program. So please use the question and answer function to pose additional questions that might be stimulated by our discussion today. So let's get started. One of the most frequent questions that we heard was, or really statements, was an acknowledgement of the emotional intensity of the video. Many viewers were moved to tears. I remember I was when I first saw it. Others expressed feelings of anger, confusion, and pride. Viewers relayed oftentimes competing concepts and emotions, like beauty and pain, tragedy and triumph, pride and fear, violence and joy. What's the significance of presenting the Black experience this way?
Well, I'll give a go. I think the significance of presenting this work online and sort of making it available to a broad swath of people is really reminiscent of how a lot of people are receiving information today. They are obtaining these difficult viewings on their devices. And I think that in this particular instance, Jafa is sort of bearing witness to many of the things that we have seen over time. And in some respects, when you think about it as a response to the work, or excuse me, when you think about it as a response to the tragedy of a George Floyd virtual or, you know, sort of visual lynching, modern day lynching, for me, I sort of conjure up thoughts about the duration of that horrible experience that we bore witness to. And this video is about 7.5 minutes long. It makes me sort of think about, you know, were these some of the images, some of the thoughts, some of the visions that were running through George Floyd's mind as he lay there prone on the ground with this police officer's foot on his neck? It is really one of those sort of provocative stories or provocative sort of opportunities, artistic sort of offerings, if you will, for us to really understand sort of the fraught and complicated relationship between Black bodies and violence and trauma and joy, and how all of those things are sometimes mediated and sort of transferred to us vis-a-vis film, video, social media. And so I think in this moment, this becomes so appropriate that this SAAM and 13 other, including 13 other institutions, were able to sort of bring this forward. It shows the sweep of history and the visual dynamics that are really sort of reflective and reminiscent of many of the experiences Black people have had to face over the years, good, bad, and otherwise.
Yeah, I think Rhea picks up on two, really interesting things and polls. One is that, Jafa has this sweeping knowledge of film history and the Black avant-garde tradition and is thinking about, early cinema and how much racial politics and white supremacy were caught up in the early film history with Birth of a Nation. But this piece is also so much about the digital experience and about how we're consuming images, and that toggling between this kind of vast sweep of history and being able to see these sort of repeated cycles and legacies, both in social dance and in treatments of violence and relationships with the police, from, again, silent era cinema to camera footage of police killings. And to see that, and then at the same time, to have it have a similar rhythmic experience to toggling on your phone and being in a moment of joy, looking at vacation photos, and then coming upon a news story that breaks you, right? That just breaks your heart apart, that is something that the web experience and this sort of emergence of so much of this moving image onto a sort of flattening platform in that way really creates. So that's one aspect of, I think, the formal that this work does, and that does so much work to get us to understand how these images work in our lives. And then there's also this kind of real foregrounding of what he talks about as like a complex view of the real, a refusal of flattening or a one-dimensionality or a limitation to what the Black experience is, so that there's not one, there's this plethora and this multi-vocality and temporality to that. And at the same time, again, structurally, the toggling between a sense of joy and pain, the kind of whiplash that that produces, is a structural truth of the US society in which Black people are facing white supremacy in a country that's talking constantly about equality and celebrating cultural achievements that are coming from that community. And so that toggling is sort of a structural reality that wraps around so much of this. And so I think a number of commenters talked about it as like the hypocrisy of America, right? How much this structure of the piece brings that forward.
And we can't dismiss the fact that within this, there are the complications. It is not, you know, as you sort of alluded and mentioned, Saisha, there are moments of trauma that are very difficult that I think this piece does not come without its own sort of problematics that need to be interrogated, in the sense that, you know, how much of sort of reviewing these problematics from the early days of cinema to present, and putting them within a sort of art context, are we necessarily re-inscribing some of these ideas and beliefs and visuals that for some have helped people to become a bit immune to many of these sort of social and structural tragedies. And the ways in which women are sort of situated or also mistreated within this arc, if you will, of history, is something that, you know, is also sort of presented in a very troubling and distressing way. But again, as you've also mentioned, at the moment that you sort of wince or are sort of experiencing trauma, then there is this idea or some sort of joyful moment that occurs. But it also creates this disjuncture that you're constantly on edge, which I think is, in some instances, the reason it is so powerful is that it really sort of affords us the opportunity for 7.5 minutes to kind of understand the intensity in which so many people, particularly Black people in this country and other people sort of socially and economically oppressed, have to constantly navigate, and how that can change on the drop of a dime.
Right, and that it's never one thing, right? So that, you know, this is a conversation within, you know, trying to figure out how to navigate double oppression, or, you know, within rights movements. But also, one of the things you said I just wanted to flag was, you know, we thought really deeply and carefully about what it meant to put this work online, and the care of doing that, because so many of the images are traumatic and troubling and triggering. And you know, one of the hopes with creating a feedback space and a conversation to follow was to allow that there is real complexity to any bringing forward of these images, even as they're carefully contextualized, or as we try to do that. So yeah, it's really tough.
Thank you both for your thoughtful considerations of that question. We have many more.
Other words.
Some viewers asked what instigated the artist to create this work. So I wonder if both of you can share what you know based on your research or your knowledge of AJ's career and his interests.
Well, you know, I think, as Saisha has sort of mentioned, and we both understand, these are ideas that AJ has been really invested in since he started, you know, working initially as a photographer or DP, and has moved into moving image work. But really sort of this question around what is Black cinema, and creating this sort of language, this lexicon, visually, sonically, and otherwise, that really interrogate what that means. Again, sort of serving in this artist role as bearing witness and ushering in the variety, the myriad voices and experiences that so often may be overlooked and just completely ignored within sort of film, the arc of cinema and film history. You know, those beautiful, subtle moments, those brief observations, those what could be considered mundane, everyday sort of opportunities that people experience, is really sort of, I think, at the heart of this artist's intention in terms of his practice.
Yeah, and he's got, you know, a very complex and expansive notion of Blackness and what's associated with it, and what the society has sort of filtered through to deal with its anxieties and racism. So sci-fi as a trope that he really looks to regularly as a place where anxieties about the alien and the other are worked through. So for a very long time, he's been assembling these, you know, notebooks where juxtapositions of found popular culture images are assembled, and he's placing them in relationship. And so the way that the relationship between two images that one I might not have even thought of in relationship to a kind of constellation of Blackness come together to do something together is a project he's sort of been working through for years, as Rhea was saying. And I think it started to come into a film context in like 2013. He did this film called Apex that just moves through the still images to electronic music very quickly. But it's one still image after another. And he was collecting those on his laptop, and he started to collect film images in a very similar way, just sort of dropping them into files and folders, thinking that there's something to all of this that is an archive of this experience. And in my reading and in the research I did, I don't think there was a moment of particular instigation. It wasn't in relation to one news story or one particular instance, but this sort of accumulation, he started to put it together, and it very quickly took shape. I think he says that he edited most of it, or the structure, in 2 hours. But then the music came later, then tweaking it and getting the shaping just right, and using this strategy that he talks about, Black visual intonation, of slowly speeding up or slowing down very subtle aspects of the framing to make the rhythm come together. And so I think that, you know, at some point it locked in and became this piece that works so intensely. But that was all sort of early 2016 into the summer of 2016. And then, yeah. And I think it's been really interesting journey for him in terms of how intently this work seemed to hit in a particular historic moment, even though it's this project, as Rhea said, that he's been working on for so long, to think about what a Black cinema and what the affect of that should be.
And it can't be dismissed that at the heart of this work, and I think him, is this insatiable love and respect for Black people. And so really using that as the modus operandi for all of the things that he chooses to do, and the ways in which he sees and respects and sort of understands sort of Blackness within the American context.
Yeah, I think you could definitely get that sense if you do watch the blow-by-blow description with Greg Tate. You really get his sort of deep appreciation for popular culture and for his found material, and his, you know, close visual analysis and his juxtaposition. So he's very much, I agree with that. So we've sort of touched on this already, but I'll pose the question again, and maybe we can address it in a different way. But viewers also had questions about the kinds of images that were incorporated into the work. So we've already discussed the sort of arc of the video, with its focus on sort of acts of violence against Black bodies, moments of joy. the citing of important political, cultural, and sports figures who have achieved, excellence against the odds, clearly. And in many ways, I think for me, it really resonated with the kinds of display that we see at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, right? That there's a kind of a parallelism there in terms of the notes that he hits and the notes that are the topics and sort of range of histories that are explored at that museum. Some respondents felt that he actually overemphasized sports and popular culture figures. So I'm wondering if we could, talk a little bit about that. Do you agree that he overemphasized sports and cultural figures, or how do we interpret his sort of use and focus on sports and popular culture?
Well, I would argue that this country and the world overemphasizes sports and music, but sports in particular, in the sense that, sports figures are often sort of considered the foundation for creating opportunities for issues to be brought forward. They share a celebrity status that, is sort of bordering on fanaticism in many instances. And so, I don't necessarily know if his sort of approach is any different than many Americans and how they feel about sports and athletes. That said, I do understand and recognize that AJ has a sort of a real affinity and sort of and values sports and athleticism and really sees this as a platform for Black people in particular to be able to sort of use this prowess, this sort of ability to shapeshift, to oftentimes sort of contort themselves and defy physics in some respects, and do that with such panache, with such sort of swag, if you will, that within that becomes for him, I think, a sort of an ultimate sort of metaphor for what Blackness can achieve, what it is, what's its possibilities. And so in that respect, I think it's more than just sort of this sort of fanatic fandom that, it could be reduced to, but that it really becomes this special project for him to sort of say, this is the embodiment of all the possibilities, and that they are rewarded, sort of remunerated, that their sort of financial reward is sort of in many instances commiserate with that sort of amazing work that they do this in spite of. And so for him, it becomes this sort of example of potentiality and possibility that is a cause for celebration. And in that respect, yes, I do think there are instances where this sort of is parallel with the project of the museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, in that, we are committed to sharing and telling a complicated story that is not all, a hall of fame. It is not sort of something that's dedicated to the best and the onlys and the first, but that it is really sort of placing at the core these human stories that show and, do not deny tragedy, but at the same time, understand the human spirit that, again, is able to shapeshift and move through some of the most heart-wrenching tragedies to sort of rise up to a place of that demonstrates the fortitude and the resilience that and the hope that is what has driven us to sort of understanding that the African American experience is critical to the narrative of the American experience. And I think in that respect, you can look at this project, Love is the Message is Death, and see many of those same tropes running through his project.
Yeah, I agree with Rhea.
Yeah, I mean, I think this makes me think of, something that Saisha said, and I think that his interest in sports and music figures I think speaks to that inherent contradiction in American society, where Black people have been really major representatives of American culture, nationally, globally, highly hyper recognizable, right? Yet as a community, they've been on the receiving end of so much injustice. It's like he's wrestling with that
these contradictions, absolutely.
With these contradictions. And I think that's why, that young woman who in the video poses the question, what would America be like if white people love Black people as much as they love Black culture, was incredibly powerful. And I think is, for me, what a lot of Jafa's juxtapositions are about. He's really making us see that.
Yeah, I guess I would be remiss as the curator at SAAM, where we have the Nam June Paik archive and collection, but one of the quotes that he often goes back to is from Paik, says, the culture that will survive, he says into the future, but I think the implication is movement and displacement is the one that lives in your head or in your nervous system. And so sports and music are cultural creations or physical things that you can manifest without needing the society to agree to give you the materials to build a building or agree to dedicate space for you. You can fully actualize those creative potentials or those talents despite the society not wanting you to, and you can carry them no matter where you go. And so those are two markers that Jafa thinks about, but also I think he connects back to a previous artist who was thinking about otherness in the American context.
So we also know that Jafa appropriated many of these clips from the web, often from YouTube. And he really is very sort of blatant, leaving evidence of that, right? The grainy nature of the images, the appearance of the Getty watermark in several instances. The one that comes to mind right now is the image of Martin Luther King being paraded in a convertible. So how might we interpret this particular reference? Is he making a comment on who owns the Black experience? And, I think for me, I really like those instances where he sort of allows us to see the Getty watermark, because to me, it's like a challenge. It's like, you can't own this, Getty. I'm taking it. And he's like flaunting it. So it's a challenge in many ways to authority.
You see it that? I mean, I think I see it that way. I think there's that aspect. I think there's also, and this goes to the sports question too, I think whenever you're working with appropriated media, you're not only making your own commentary, but you're pointing to the commentary that's implicit within that media already, right? So the overemphasis perhaps on sports figures is begging that question of sort of how much attention and time on media is taken up with that. The Getty watermark, I think both can be a reclaiming, but also points to, as you said, this ownership or the capitalization on a traumatic history. And so for me, I also have to say, I feel like it's a reminder that all of this material that ends up on the web is once again becoming commercial content. It's content that's driving capital, that's becoming a commodity for large corporations, and who's benefiting, who is making money from us uploading personal tragedies or birthday parties or onto YouTube. Like, where is that value accruing? So for me, it's a reminder of that bigger picture too.
Just to piggyback off of that, Saisha, the meta narrative of this is such that, yet again, the Black body becomes commodified, right? And so these entities who often get the history wrong, like, a Getty image, you can go, the captions will completely misname an individual or experience. I think, he's sort of feeling as though, he can take that image back. How can you yet again own someone's image and own their sort of identity, if you will. And so in that respect, he is sort of, again, reappropriating, re-identifying. And I think then on a functional level, if we understand that this was sort of a culmination of ideas and thoughts that he had been sort of amassing over years, it, I think, also sort of speaks to that kind of organic process of creating this work, that it was one that is also a bit raw in, you know, sort of, again, the various generations of the different media that he chooses. So he's giving us sort of a peek into his process that way. And I think it also provides us with that reading as well.
Okay, we have a couple more questions about specific aspects of the work. Viewers also wondered about the image of the sun and its significance. I wonder if you could address that.
You know, I think as Saisha, you were mentioning sort of his value, his respect, his interest in Afrofuturism, and I think the sun becomes sort of emblematic of, you know, this approach to you know, looking toward the future, also recognizing the sun as this star that you know, constantly is burning, that it has these opportunities where it becomes sort of a situation where it's the whole, but then you'll see these instances of sunbursts or these bursts that come out, which I think is symbolic of the various opportunities or people who break out and, you know, Dougie, or they break out and do these, you know, fantastic dance moves, or the, you know, Crip Walk for Serena Williams. And so I think that the sun becomes another sort of visual metaphor that ties together. And again, it becomes, you know, this place of respite. We all, you know, the sun, we all need the sun. We all need, what would life be without Black people? What would life be without the sun? And so it becomes this, I think, opportunity for us to engage it again in these variety of ways that allow us to think more carefully about not only the group, the whole, but also individuals. And I think that's what the project essentially is also challenging us to do.
Yeah. Great. I wanted to read one comment, just straight from what the respondent said. So, quote, many of the images Jafa chose subvert respectability as defined in a white supremacist culture. To me, this is incredibly powerful and healing, though the images themselves are painful. And again, this kind of relates back to some earlier points we made. What do you all make about the respectability politics of this work?
Yeah, I know that respectability is just not something that is a part of AJ's sort of function in terms of, you know, his art practice. I would venture to say that it's quite the contrary. He's far more committed in sort of a flattening of these ideas about sort of what is appropriate and what is inappropriate. You know, as Saisha was mentioning in terms of his process, you know, really being a nonlinear thinker and piecing these things together in a way that allows us to sort of think through the various sort of connections, I think is consistent with someone who is not sort of wrapped up in these kind of strictures of class or respectability or appropriateness. And so with respect to it, you know, I would understand how it is so difficult to watch many of these images that flash before our eyes. Nevertheless, as it relates to sort of, is this appropriate or good enough, is just not something that I think he's focused on.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there were a lot of comments also about sort of twerking, right? Like if there is a emphasis on sports, there was also a question about sort of the emphasis on sexuality or twerking. And I think, again, he'd almost go to a sports analogy, like that's physically amazing, right? And it is and it is part of the total planetary view of Blackness and what Black people are producing that is being co-opted and appropriated, and we're going to claim it here, and not bringing to it the respectability filter that he's just not using, because as this commenter points to, I think a lot of it comes from a place that is attempting to say what is and isn't appropriate and what is and isn't healthy for people that filter has been totally oppressing in and of itself, and so that politics can't be the one that he's going to bring to a vision that is about loving everything that's coming out of that sun, if you will.
That said, though, it is complicated, as you even pointed out earlier, especially when we look at sort of these images of women and how this physicality can so easily be, and he even sort of teases it out where that physicality can often skew into some disturbing experiences and vulnerabilities for Black women. And I think that within this project, the ways in which women are presented can be something that it would be nice to have a bit more respectability in that regard, but that's not his project.
Yeah.
Okay, we have 2 more questions before we look at the questions that we've received. There were several folks who wondered about the artist's use of Kanye West's Ultralight Beam as a soundtrack for this production. Some respondents were offended by the use of Kanye West music, really not appreciating West's controversial political positions. What do you all make of his using West music in this project?
Well, I think, as we pointed out, this was done in 2016. The Kanye of 2016 is not even the Kanye of the George Bush era, right? When he said, George Bush don't care about Black people after his lackluster response, Bush's lackluster response to Hurricane Katrina. And so, I think Kanye may actually be best choice, right? In the sense that he's constantly changing. He's a complicated figure. He is complex. And he is also using an ensemble in this song. It is not just Kanye's voice that we hear. It is not just, his politics that are being evoked. He is, sonically looking at a lot of Black traditions within the production of that song. And all of those things create, I think, this magnificent sun that sometimes bursts, sometimes burns, but is forever moving. And sometimes it's more visible to us when it's moving, and other times it's not. So, the Kanye of last week is not the Kanye of early 2016.
This song is incredible, and the talents that it brings together, Chance the Rapper makes it for me, like the passage that really gets
Saisha.
that passage. So it's also sort of can be all this multi-vocality, as you said. And when Jafa was at our museum, he was in conversation with Jatavia Gary, who's another incredible filmmaker who's forwarding this tradition that people should check out. But he said, they brought this up, I don't discard Black people. And I think that comes back to this kind of quote unquote respectability filter of like, that's not the project here. The project is this love for like experiences and people, and finding a way to value them even if they're not conforming to the expectation that of what they should be doing. And so I don't know, that gives me pause and makes me think about my work as a curator in an institution where there's lots of work that's produced out of ideologies that are problematic and by people with biographies that are problematic, and like, what do we do with that? It's not a simple answer, but you know, it's something that we're all navigating in different ways.
Absolutely, and I think that is a good segue to the last question. Before we go to the newer questions, is that some of the respondents also wanted to know directly about how SAAM was planning to address issues of white supremacy and bias at our institution. So, and I think that we all know that this question, you know, emerges out of how this current moment of racial reckoning has really renewed and intensified, you know, these debates. And you know, to greater and has brought really great awareness to how museums both in the United States and globally, because this is not just a United States problem, have really been complicit, you know, with the dominant culture, you know, be it white supremacist, colonialist, imperialist, sexist, heteronormative. We can, you know, kind of go on and on. You know, so what steps are we taking? You know, and I think I'll take that question. I think that, you know, our leadership, as Stephanie mentioned, and staff is really asking this question and in the midst of devising strategies to address it. You know, I think that we're right in the middle of it. It's not a simple, there's no simple way to address this. There's no panacea. There's no one thing that you can do to sort of undo it. We have to really think and act very holistically. And, you know, on a practical level, I think, or as I like to say, on the sort of 101 level, there are very basic things that we need to do. Right? We need to make sure that our staff reflects America. Because I think diversity and inclusion makes us stronger and makes us more resourceful as an institution. I think that we have to root out unconscious bias in the day-to-day culture of our institution, which involves everything from, you know, training staff to be more aware of their own biases, or really looking at how white supremacy becomes manifest in our institutional culture. I think we must continue to expand diversity at the level of the board, at the level of sort of leadership across the institution. I think we also need to make sure that we are really meaningfully serving our local audiences of color in the DMV. This is, you know, this is a national story, it's a global story, but it's a real local story as well, you know, in terms of the relationship that we have with our immediate community that in this COVID and post-COVID context is going to be even more important. So that's a real important thing. And I think that we also need to have transparent accountability, you know, so we need to evaluate how we're doing, you know, where we're still lacking. So that's, you know, to me, what I think of is like the 101 level, right? And then you have to go a little bit deeper than that. I think symbolically and really in terms of our institutional soul, you know, I think it's really important for us to root out bias and white supremacy, especially because we're a federally funded institution in the nation's capital. That makes what we do here even more important. We have a real responsibility to be inclusive, complex, and accurate in our presentation of American art, culture, and history. And I think that as part of the Smithsonian, that we really should be a model and set the standard, you know, so I think this is really important. I also think that we must work to sort of understand and undo our complicity. And I think, you know, I speak for a lot of the curators at my museum, you know, that, you know, we walk through the galleries and we ask ourselves, well, whose stories are privileged here, right? You know, whose stories have been, excluded because of the choices that we've made. I think about, which artists get solo exhibitions at museums. I mean, I think if you start analyzing that, it'll be clear that, Black, Indigenous, people of color are still underrepresented in solo exhibitions, are underrepresented in exhibitions that get catalogs, which have an impact on future histories. So I think we may need to really create new criteria for evaluating potential exhibitions, sort of what is important in this context. So I think we have to really assess our past and really set a different course forward. I think for SAAM, I think we also need to acknowledge that the story is not all negative. I think we as an institution, have major collections of African American and Latinx art. That's one of the reasons why, we pursued Arthur Jafa's work, because it could sort of exist in this ensemble of other things. And these collections have been amassed over decades. They just didn't happen, 3 months ago. And we've made some real investments in resources. We've established curatorial positions like mine in Latinx art. We recently appointed our first curator of Native American art and crafts in a joint position between the Renwick and the National Museum of the American Indian. Many of our new acquisitions are focusing on Black, Asian American, Latinx women artists, and increasingly Indigenous artists. So we are making progress, and we have been making progress, and it's been a priority for us. And we need to really double down on this effort. And I mean, I could go on and talking. I also have to say that I feel every day, I feel fortunate to be at an institution that is headed by Lonnie Bunch, right? I think in the statements that he's made, the public statements that he's made, the internal statements that he's made, he is really setting the right example and the right goals for us as an institution. I think Stephanie was reflecting on those in her statements. And I think that museums are really wonderful places to pose difficult conversations in productive ways. And so this especially excites me about being at an art museum, where the experiences that viewers have are interpretive. So there's a different kind of learning that can take place here that I think could be really emancipatory. So there are other things that can be said. I'm going to look at some of the questions and see what we would like to engage. So as I'm looking at questions, Rhea, I'm wondering if you could talk about the conversations taking place at your museum around this issue.
Sure. Many of the things that you have so eloquently described, I think, are at top of mind at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. In fact, we literally started discussions within the institution about ways in which we can connect and address interactions amongst staff, looking at unconscious bias, the ways in which diversity and equity and inclusion are not only happening sort of outward, but also part of the work culture. From an outward perspective, our Department of Education worked very closely with a variety of entities and developed this wonderful portal, a race portal, that has been met with tremendous sort of success and positive feedback that really allows individuals, educators, others to tackle and grapple with these complex questions around race and diversity and inclusion, and really pose opportunities for so for families and for institutions to address things in a way that feels not necessarily combative or that you judged. We're recognizing and really sort of, I think, even at the heart of the exhibitions and work that we've done, it's been about sort of using a transformational sort of pedagogy in the ways in which we want people to come to the work, not necessarily feeling that it is something where, you know, you have to feel dismissed or bad if you don't know a particular subject, but that this becomes a way for you to sort of engage in a way to pose more questions that allow an individual to really sort of do some self-reflecting and work that will hopefully help to sort of see not only the individual, but community or collective experience as one that we all share responsibility. And so I think it's in that vein that the museum is continuing to engage in addressing these topics. We're also working closely with some of our fellow institutions, the American History Museum and the Anacostia, to work on collecting a lot of the objects around the recent protest activities and the ways in which not only COVID-19 has been taking place, but as a friend of mine call it COVID-16-19, so that we're able to really look at how these intersecting structural issues have sort of made themselves manifest here in the district, and then use that as a way to further conversations through exhibitions, through opportunities for digital collecting and digital storytelling. So these are ideas that have remained at the top of mind for the institution, and we have done things programmatically, but also internally. We're doing things just as you are.
Great, that's wonderful. I did want to just say one thing that I forgot to mention is another thing that really gives me hope about the current moment for our institution is that over the next 3 years, we'll be planning and implementing a reinstallation of all of our permanent collection galleries. Mm-hmm. And this is such a major opportunity to really rewrite narratives. The curators are intensely involved in these discussions. You know, we intend to, you know, have focus groups with audience members to help sort of help us in during this, you know, process of organizing it. But, you know, I really think that, you know, we're not going to shy away from, you know, the true histories of this country, you know, and looking and putting art at the center of unlocking and helping us understand the impact of those historical experiences.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, I was thinking of Jafa's quote, like that we need like a complex vision of the real. And I think that that's what's driving our reinstallation project, really rethinking narratives, right? It's not just what's on the wall, but how we're talking about it, what we're valuing, like what stories about individual achievement and celebrity are framing our kind of way of understanding art, or can we think of each of these as emanations, and what kind of culture are they emanating from, and what is that star energy giving off, right? So those are other ways of telling these stories too.
Okay, so we just have a few minutes, and hopefully people could stay on for just a couple minutes more. But a question that we received twice is, what is the meaning of the title? And one person said, could the panel address the title of Arthur Jafa's piece, the idea of mediated messages, or a message references so much, including McLuhan?
Sorry, what was the last part of that?
The idea of mediated messages or a message references so much, including, I'm probably mispronouncing the last name, McLuhan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so I just was looking at my notes because I have a very specific answer. So there was a sci-fi short story called Love is the Plan is Death, that this is a direct play on. And so there's a spider-like creature who devours their mate. I mean, I think it's a bit of a far thing, but again, this interest in sci-fi, but I do think the contrast between love and death is a powerful, provocative one that runs through this whole piece. I don't know, do you want to talk to that, Rhea, or the message part, I can jump in on McLuhan.
Well, I think that it's really, you know, sort of playing off of the tension and that duality. And so again, you know, love, death, these are sort of, I think, the through lines for what the meaning of life is, really, you know, and that ultimately the message is that we are all, if you will, messengers. We all are sort of transferring one thing or the other in terms of, you know, sort of sharing this knowledge, sharing our values within sort of as individuals within this world, but ultimately it's about sort of, I think for him also, this message of love is at the heart of what he does. It's his love for Black people, his love for Black film, his understanding of, you know, sort of the power of music and how that plays into the ways in which we understand and live through life. And so, yeah, again, it's this sort of bookending of love as sort of the sort of impetus of it all, but then death is ultimately, you know, sort of the meaning of life. It's going to happen. So,
and then I think, you know, the replacement of plan with message, you know, this is both a work that clearly has a message, right? This is not in the art for art's sake, like abstract painting category. This is a work that has a very clear argument and wants to convey that message, I think, very strongly. And I do think, you know, the question asks about the media as the message is a quote from Marshall McLuhan, and very much something that Jafa would have been very aware of. And I do think that there's an invocation of that too, in terms of thinking about all the things we've talked about, the media, the use of YouTube, the way that the digitization of all of this material affects how it affects us. So I think all of that's in there, yeah.
Well, thank you. We received other questions that really resonated with some of our discussion early on. People wanted to have a few more discussions about respectability and sports figures, but we're coming to the end of our time together. So thank you so much for being panelists. Just can't totally enjoyed this conversation. And I also want to thank the wonderful SAAM team across departments, including curatorial, education, interpretation, external affairs, digital strategies, for not only making today possible, but also the Arthur Jafa screenings as well. It took a lot of work and it took a village to mount that show. We invite everyone to follow us on social media channels at American Art. We'll be doing more deep digital dives into our collection, so please continue visiting our website for more information. And we look forward to eventually inviting you back to our museum and to hopefully finding ways to have more discussions about our upcoming reinstallation. So thank you so much. And I look forward to—
Thank you, Rhea, in particular, for joining us. It's been such a pleasure to be in conversation across our institutions. And thank you for everybody who joined us.
Yes, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. I'm really glad that we had this chance to engage this very important and powerful work. So thank you so much.
And Stephanie is here to thank the panelists one more time. Virtual applause coming at you. Thank you all.
Bye-bye. Have a great afternoon, everyone.